thank you very much for joining us at this first CRA webinar for the year of 2025. My name is Chris Hattingh. I'm the Executive Director at the CRA. I'm joined today in our discussion by CRA Director Dr. John Endres, as well as Nicholas Lorimer, Geopolitics Researcher at the Institute of Race Relations. Nick and John, good morning to you as well. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get into today's discussion, which will be about the latest State of the Nation address by President Ramaphosa. The webinar is being recorded, so if you have to drop off for any reason, you shouldn't have to because we don't have load shedding anymore, but maybe due to connectivity issues, if you have to drop off, we are recording, so the recording will be made available. Any questions that you have for myself and my fellow panelists, please pop those into the Q&A box throughout the discussion, and I'll share those accordingly. I'll take the easiest ones and share the more difficult ones with Nick and John. And then just a final note before we kick off, a special welcome to all of our CRA premium clients joining us for today's discussion, for today's webinar. For those of you not yet clients of the CRA, we trust you will join up as clients following this webinar. So with that, we get started on the State of the Nation Address 2025 by President Ramaphosa, delivered yesterday evening. To give you an idea of today's briefing, our discussion will cover which elements of the address cover domestic issues for South Africa. We'll go into global considerations, where a SONA doesn't always touch on geopolitical and foreign policy matters, but given recent developments, no surprise that the president touched on those. And then finally, we get to our key takeaways, some things for us to mull over and use as we go forward in what should be quite a tumultuous year, at least next few years as well, given what's happening on the geopolitical front. So we start with domestic matters. I think a very strong focus here on growth, going for growth, strong growth narrative. Whether we believe that is credible or not is a different question, but the president aiming for 3% growth this year. John, I'm going to start with you just to talk a little bit about that focus. So with SONAs, I guess some of the issue is that a lot of one SONA repeats what was said the year before. Do you think there was more in this particular SONA, at least on the rhetoric in terms of growth focus, that is noteworthy?
Well, I think that the lip service was there, and that is an encouraging development. But in my view, there's not really that much substance that is going to deliver growth. And it seems to be that looking at the president's comments, he's pinning his hopes on spending lots of money and then hoping that will trigger growth. So there's talk of various funds that are to be established, an infrastructure fund and a transformation fund, this fund, another fund, et cetera, with billions and billions of rands being deployed in the interests of growth, supposedly. But I'm skeptical about that, because I believe that as long as the investment environment is not favorable, growth won't happen. And so these infrastructure projects are necessary. They do need to happen to give the economy some scope to growth, but it won't be enough. I think it's going to give us maybe 2 to 3% growth, but I don't think it's going to give us those really high growth rates that the country needs to make a sustainable impact on unemployment and rising poverty.
Nick, if I can come to you a bit, what do you think of maybe that note that the president struck, and which I thought was interesting? Maybe it does show that the comments have gotten to him.
Yeah, so I think it was interesting that he sort of, in a sense, kind of danced around exactly what was the criticism. He made, as you said, these sort of references to, I think the headline that lots of news organizations are carrying this morning is "We will not be bullied," which is exactly what he would have wanted people to take away from that, a sort of defiant sounding tone, which I think he needed to do, because if you're criticized strongly by another foreign leader, you need to sort of push back a bit. But there was a bit in the speech where he sort of implied that the reason South Africa was being targeted by the US was because South Africans stand for peace and justice and a non-racial future and protection and equal rights for women, people with disabilities, members of the LGBT community, etc. And that South Africa was opposed to a world where it was all survival of the fittest. But this is not really kind of addressing the point of what the criticisms of South Africa were. I mean, he could have said something like, "We're not afraid to chart our own course in difficult diplomatic waters, and we will not be bullied onto picking a side or being more explicit about what exactly he was pushing back. Instead, he sort of claimed that it was these values which were the only reason that South Africa was under attack. And that's not really the case. The reason that we're being attacked by the US is not just because some of our domestic economic choices, but more importantly, because of our stances on global affairs, which are much less clear cut than the president kind of, I think, tried to lay out. We've been far more ambiguous about a number of conflicts. I think about the war in Ukraine, places like that. So, it sounded strong, but I don't think there was a lot of substance actually behind his pushback. It was still skirting around the issue of exactly what South Africa was being attacked for.
John, coming to you, how do you think the president handled I guess, those two things? So on the one hand, the lofty sentiment and rhetoric versus actually acknowledging reality has not yet shifted. Things have been positive following the formation of the GNU, but we're not yet seeing that in the real numbers.
Yeah, I thought in a way the title of the speech was a misnomer because he didn't really give us the state of the nation. So you'll see, a lot of what he spoke about was plans for the future and, desires that we have. We will do X, we promise to do Y, we call on business to do the other thing. It's all things that lie in the future, just over that hill. But when it comes to things that have actually been achieved, there's not that much there. There's a few references to successes since the end of apartheid, which is now 30 years ago. There's a bit of reference to the successes at Home Affairs without naming the minister or the party that he belongs to. So carefully omitting any mention that was the DA and a DA minister that achieved that. And I think that's where the speech falls down. And as we've been discussing this, we've been saying that this in a way feels like all the other SONAs. Every year it's sort of like this. And what makes it similar every year is that it's always promises. There's always next year's going to be better, growth is coming, the water problems will be solved, the municipalities will be sorted out, et cetera, et cetera. But the actual delivery is not very impressive. And so if we think of the way that a SONA could sound, the kind of SONA I think that South Africans would like to see would be one that says, last year we reduced the number of water outages from, 48 hours in 50% of municipalities. We brought that down to just 10% of municipalities now being affected. We can see that we're making progress on doing this, et cetera, et cetera. And the only area that he gave us a statistic like that was really on Home Affairs, where he said 90% of the backlog has been cleared. That's actually the kind of thing you want to hear. And there's not enough of that in the SONA to, I think, really inspire confidence.
Do you think there's a realization that some of the policies in place need to be at least watered down or removed?
So short answer, no, but let me give you a longer answer. He began his speech very well by saying, our most urgent task is to grow the economy so we can create jobs, reduce poverty, and improve the lives of all South Africans. And I think that is a sentiment that the government, at least rhetorically, is increasingly emphasizing. But then when it got to what the sort of actual specifics were, it was, as John mentioned, just a regurgitation of so many things that have been said before. He talked about he claimed, for example, to start off with, that the increased enthusiasm in the South African government was because of the success of the economic reforms that it had been implementing, not the formation of the GNU, which is, I think, the real reason for the optimism. The reforms there was supposedly a second wave of economic reforms. The first wave hasn't made much of an impact because it's been far too limited in his much touted Operation Vulindlela. He talked now about a second wave of reforms, which would include dealing with the water crisis, which is not really a reform, addressing local government dysfunction, which is also not really a reform, and digitizing the government services. There's no sort of mention of actually kind of changing the economic policy in a proper way. As far as economic policy was mentioned, it was things like the old favorites like localization and beneficiation and all these sort of projects that the ANC government has been very keen on for at least the last decade, but have borne little fruit in their pursuit so far. So there was an enormous. I really was looking forward to coming into the speech last night, listening to sort of a bold new approach to South Africa, that the government of national unity had shifted our politics in an important direction, and that there was going to be some sort of concrete commitment to changing policies on growth. But we're going back to the well here on exactly all of the same old tired stories that have been tried over the last more than a decade and just haven't produced results. We're seeing unemployment rise under President Ramaphosa. We've seen poverty grow, and there's just a sort of a regurgitation of the same things over and over again. The growth target itself was even quite modest. It was only 3% that he talked about, which is not even close to what we need to actually begin lifting the country out of poverty. As for infrastructure, infrastructure is the easiest thing for a politician to talk about. Nobody on earth is opposed to infrastructure, whether you're on the right or the left, whether you're a fiscal conservative or a big spender. Pretty much everyone thinks that infrastructure is a good thing that government should do and that will pay for itself in the end. So it's very easy to promise lots of big infrastructure spending. It's also worth reminding ourselves that the return on investment for a lot of infrastructure spending is not amazing in South Africa. Unfortunately, problems like corruption, misallocation of resources, that kind of thing, really brings down the value we get from infrastructure development. Never mind all the delays and things. So infrastructure development is definitely needed, but you can't just rely on saying we're going to get all of our roads and ports back to a state where we can export goods. That's just not good enough. You actually need to unlock some new potential. And there just was nothing of that in the speech as far as I could tell.
If I could add to that, maybe, I think that, those of us who are old enough to remember the 2nd of February 1990 will remember that was a big bang opening of Parliament. That was the sort of the unbanning of the ANC, the release of Nelson Mandela, etc., etc. And I think we kind of live in the hope and expectations that at some point there will be another big bang SONA that does introduce the kind of reforms that need to happen for the economy to grow fast. And when we get what we got last year and the year before that and the year before that, it does feel like a damp squib. It's a letdown because it's the same thing every time, and it means that the outcomes are not really going to change.
If we keep in mind and keep in context, since between 2013 and 2024, South African GDP per annum averaged 0.8%. To get out of that sort of hole requires quite a lot of reform and a lot of work. And I wonder when one is caught in, or when one is in the situation where reforms, if they're happening, are done very incrementally, one might lose sight of progress that is being made. So to mention a colleague, Terence Corrigan, favorite word of his, pragmatism, for me to push the pragmatic side here, that these sorts of things take quite a bit of time. Just some of the elements in the speech I wanted to highlight, if we want to accept that elements of reform are being implemented, at least in terms of rhetoric. So, for example, a competitive energy market in Transnet, introducing competition in terms of logistics, the sorts of things that you never even had discussed before the formation of the government of national unity, when you only had one political party dominating cabinet. That's not to say it's going to happen, but just elements of a different kind of thinking being introduced. The issues around municipalities, ring fencing funds for maintenance, for investment in things like water infrastructure. Again, whether that happens or not is a different question. Just those two, maybe John, for you to pick up on. Were there other elements where you think there is an element of more pragmatism and just a realization that reality is quite harsh at the moment and government needs to think differently?
Yeah, I think that we're still at the lip service stage, and that's kind of nice, but it's not enough. And one example here would be the network statement put out by by Transnet last year in December, which is meant to describe ways for private operators to come into the railway sector and run trains on tracks and sort of take over some of the functions of Transnet. And as we wrote about in our risk alert, I think last weekend on Monday, the network statement, so it makes a few moves in the right direction. So it sort of creates more favorable conditions for private sector participation. It doesn't actually go far enough. And one of the areas that doesn't go far enough is in the area of who's responsible for maintaining the infrastructure and for expanding the infrastructure. And as a private operator, you're coming in, you want to run your trains on a certain line, and you've got permission to do so. You've got to pay the operator a certain tariff to be allowed to do that. But you're going to wonder, like, is the track going to fall apart while my trains roll over it? Because that's actually not my control. Like, the state wants to stay in control of the quality of the tracks, but I won't be able to run my service if that quality is not up to standard. So what I think we're seeing is something that in the software industry is referred to as vaporware. That's where you sort of develop software and you make promises about what it can do, but it's actually not real. It's sort of a bit make-believe and a bit vague. And maybe you'll get a proper piece of software out of it in the end, but maybe you don't. It's sort of, at the moment, I think we're at the vaporware stage. The view from the top probably looks like every problem can be solved by the government because, that's where you are. But just to take a step back and say, actually, often that doesn't work. And South Africa is a good proof of the example where that doesn't work.
Thanks, John. Any final words of wisdom from you, Nick, before I close it out?
I think I was a bit disappointed by this speech. I thought that it was a missed opportunity, and that South Africa has unfortunately had a string of missed opportunities in the last couple of years. We're not in a position with 40% unemployment to have more missed opportunities. And if we want to see prosperity, the next Sona can't be like this.
Thanks very much, Nick. We will close on that particular note from John and Nick respectively. I want to thank everyone for your time on this Friday morning, for spending an hour with us. We trust we provided insights and useful analysis for you. I know it gets frustrating in the moment. We want to see more progress and more reform, but a large part of our role at the CRA and our responsibility is to look at the data that we've collected on the country since 1929, to present that to you, our clients, to South Africa, so that you can make informed decisions about what reality is, not what we would want it to be, and how we deal with the risks coming down the line, but also how we seize the opportunities that no doubt will arise from a very volatile, shifting domestic and global environment. So we encourage you, if you're not yet a premium client of the CRA, to get in touch with us. You can contact Sherwin van Black, his email address on the screen at the moment, and we will have that discussion with you. On that note, thank you all very much for your time. We look forward to upcoming webinars, briefings, and more discussions in what I'm sure will be a very interesting year for South Africa and the world. Until next time, this is Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.